ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very warm and humid BLSI tonight. It's great to see so many of you here, as well in the room, as well as online. So there is obviously still an interest in the interpretation of scriptures, which is fantastic to see. And I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting and thought-provoking and probably sort of good discussion afterwards in the Q&A session in terms of what it all means. On to the star attraction today. As you can see, due to unforeseen circumstances, Don can't be with us in person today, but he's on live stream, and he will obviously do his presentation and then take the Q&As in the normal way. Now, it's a fantastic pleasure and honor for me to actually introduce every speaker that I introduce, but in particular today, Don. Don is such a wonderful human being, you know, and I could go on forever and ever to talk about Don. I've probably only got a couple of minutes, so I just want to say a couple of things. One is, he is a world-renowned aeronaut, which most of you will know. He is also at the helm of the largest air balloon manufacturing company in the world. He is the creator of the International Balloon Fiesta in Bristol, and is still their chairman and sorting it out, and getting sponsorship and getting the people together is no mean feat. And if that wasn't enough, he's been at the BLSI for longer than I have. So we're talking sort of 20 years really. And in that time, he's performed various functions. He's been the philosophy co-convener. He's been as part of the program subcommittee. He's also been part of the management of this place. And he's organized hundreds of lectures, and he has given probably dozens. So please, please, please put your hands together to welcome Don onto the virtual stage. Over to you, Don.
Thank you, Andreas, for that rather over-flattering introduction. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening. I had a little medical problem, which turned out to be so minor that they weren't even sure that I'd had it. But they told me I wasn't allowed to drive for 28 days, so I've been keeping to the rules. My talk this evening concerns the scholarly examination of the early Christianity and the Christian Bible from a historical and critical viewpoint. This type of study began in Germany, and for many years happened only in Germany, but it is now worldwide in academic institutions. It's not my intention this evening to give any opinion about the religious or devotional values of the Bible, but simply to look at it from a historical viewpoint. What I have to say will neither reinforce nor to challenge the Christian faith. But for those who hold that the Bible is perfect and without error, they will be, I'm afraid, disappointed. I must begin by admitting that I'm not a specialist in this area myself. And my excuse for giving a talk on it is simply that I found it very interesting. And I don't think it's something that gets very much attention from the general reader. My knowledge is derived not only from the book itself, but from quite a number of authors. But in particular, I'm informed by the work of Bart Ehrman, who is an American author who's written a really good selection of books on this subject. The Christian Bible comprises both the Old and the New Testament, and it's been printed into more copies than any other book in history. It certainly has had more influence on our history than any other book, and it's well worth studying and understanding by people who are believers and those who are not. The historical critical approach to the Bible is hardly known to the general public, although it has been going on for about 200 years or more. And the scholars have studied archaeology and analyzed in detail the most ancient manuscripts that they can find. The New Testament was originally written in Greek and the Old Testament in Hebrew. The language of Jesus was neither of these. It was Aramaic, although he would probably have had some knowledge of them. So the aim of scholars is to understand how the Bible came to be written and how this fits into the history of early Christianity. The question is, can we reconstruct something that is verifiable? Who wrote it? And of the many texts circulating in the first few centuries, how did some enter the canon while others were rejected? Do we have the words exactly as written by the original authors? And how were they affected by the culture and the assumptions of their time? Why do we find that they sometimes contradict each other? Historians are very dependent on the written word, and the writing that survives may not tell the whole story. Books 2,000 years ago were very different from today. Few people could read, and even fewer could write. Printing was still 15 centuries in the future, and everything was written by hand. Scribes made a living by creating further copies of the book from the originals. And of course, books were very expensive and rare. Scholars today don't have the original documents that the authors produced. Only copies survive, and most of these were made many centuries after the after the original was written. And differences can creep in every time a copy is made. And what's available today is usually a copy of a copy of a copy many times over. When the more than one ancient copy of a document can be found, the differences can be seen. Many are simple errors in spelling or grammar, but sometimes scribes would miss out entire passages, and sometimes they would insert passages to get their own point of view across, or perhaps to make the things correspond to the current theological belief. We do the same thing today if we reprint a book that has unacceptable terminology, so it's not too surprising. Forgery was rife in the ancient world because it was so easy to get away with. A book by a famous author was worth a lot more money than one by an unknown. So if you don't have a copy from a famous author, why not make one up? Often the motivation was not financial, but simply as a means of getting the forger's views across. A newly discovered book by a famous author will receive more attention than one by an unknown writer. Some forgers, of course, were cleverer than others. For example, quoting a historical event that happened after the death of the alleged author is a complete giveaway. But modern scholars are much more skilled at detection, using computers, for example, to detect differences in writing style. It's now known that several books in the New Testament are forgeries, including 6 of the epistles of Paul. These were written by someone else using Paul's name and sometimes diverging from the views that Paul himself expresses in his undisputed writings. Despite this, they were successful in being accepted into the canonical list of 27 books. For scribes in those days, it was something of a Wild West. There were no laws of copyright, and people had no access to information, so the risk of being found out was quite low. But despite all these problems, there is much to be learned from Scripture and from the ancient books that did not make it into the canon, known as the apocrypha. Despite all the difficulties, scholars can make some useful deductions about what was really happening during the formative time of Christianity. I will be speaking mostly this evening about the New Testament. The Old Testament, of course, has lots of interest also, in fact, possibly more so, but it's beyond my scope this evening. As far as we know, Jesus wrote nothing. It's not even known for sure whether he and his followers could write, because they came from an agricultural area of Galilee where education was probably limited. The Gospels were written anonymously 40 to 70 years after the crucifixion by people working from oral traditions that had become established by that time. The authors were educated Greek speakers who probably had little contact with the people of the in the Aramaic speaking population, who were the eyewitnesses of events. So it's inevitable that the oral tradition lost some detail and possibly became embellished in others. Originally, the Gospels were unnamed, and the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were applied some centuries later. The first three are known as the Synoptic Gospels, and they have many similarities, but John is quite different. So scholars have established the approximate dates when they were written. The first Gospel to be written was Mark, around 70, the year 70, or 40 years after Jesus' death. It's the shortest of the four. Matthew was written around 85, and Luke perhaps a little later. And both Matthew and Luke incorporate quite large sections of Mark. They have other materials in common as well, which is not in Mark. And scholars believe they got this from another source, which is now lost. And that source is designated as Q, which comes from the German word for source. Matthew and Luke both have other materials which is unique to each of them. John is the last of the Gospels to be written in sometime between 90 and 100. That's 60 to 70 years after the crucifixion. And by this time, survivals from the lifetime of Jesus were few. In John, the new religion has evolved beyond that of the synoptics. The earliest writings in the New Testament are from Paul, about 20 years after the crucifixion. 13 books of the New Testament bear his name, although, as I've said, only 7 are probably written by him. The Bible contains a great many contradictions, mostly trivial, but a good number are significant. Now we'll talk about a few of these. The first one concerns the Nativity. The story of Jesus' birth appears in only 2 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Writing 55 to 60 years after, they probably had little to go on, but the tradition had some fixed points. It was prophesied that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. It was known that he was born to Mary, who had been impregnated by the Holy Spirit, and she was married to Joseph. But it was also widely known that he came from Nazareth, 90 miles to the north of Bethlehem. Around these elements, the writers wove 2 quite different tales. Matthew has Jesus born in Bethlehem because his parents presumably lived there. The Magi came following a star which took them to a house. Try looking at any star in the sky on a clear night and decide which house it lies over. So it sounds not too plausible. But King Herod wanted to kill all baby boys, so Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt. And when they come back, it's still dangerous, so they relocate to Nazareth. Luke, on the other hand, has Mary and Joseph living in Nazareth to begin with. They traveled to Bethlehem during the reign of Herod, while Quirinius was Roman governor of Syria. They traveled for a census of the whole Roman Empire. They have to do this because Joseph is apparently a direct descendant of David, the famous king. And that's 1,000 years before their lifetime. No trace of this census exists in any other Roman or ancient record. It would certainly be a very interesting document if it could be found. And Quirinius is known to have taken office a decade after Herod had died. So Luke didn't quite have it right there. There's no room in the inn, and Jesus is born in a stable. There are shepherds, but no Magi, no star, and no trip to Egypt. And they go home to Nazareth soon afterwards. So The picture that you see here is a bit of a conflation of the two stories. There are genealogies. The list of male ancestors of Jesus is given by both Matthew and Luke, but they give a list of names going all the way back to David, 1,000 years before, and then going all the way back to Abraham. And Luke does a little more because he goes all the way back to Adam. One would wonder where they could have got these records from. We might doubt that they could have been kept. But we also find that the names in the two lists are quite different. So, and then there was a problem that Jesus had to be descended from the king of David through Joseph. But at the same time, he's the son of God, not the son of Joseph. And then there's the later belief that he has always existed even before creation. So how can he be descended from anybody? So there's some questions there. But the writers were writing the story as best they knew it from the written tradition. And then there's the question of Paul's attitude to women. In the churches founded by Paul, there was considerable equality for women. They filled the roles of pastors, deacons, and patrons. Paul writes in Galatians, which is one of his undisputed writings, "For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ." Yet in contrast, we find in Timothy, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." And in 1 Corinthians, he's alleged to have said, "Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is a disgrace for a woman to speak in church." So how can these be reconciled? Scholars' belief today is, of course, that Timothy was a forgery written after the death of Paul. So that could explain why it was the ideas of his time and not the ideas of Paul himself that got into it. But Corinthians is accepted as an undisputed writing. So the only possibility is that that was an insertion by a later scribe who was conforming to the ideas of his time. Paul, of course, was very open to equality within the church, but he didn't advocate full social change. For example, he didn't urge slaves to leave their masters or full equality for women. None of these mattered because time was short. The world was going to end soon. There's another interesting difference in Paul's visit to the apostles. In Galatians, he says, "But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was. But I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem." But in Acts, the author of Acts says, Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. And this was supposed to be just after recovering his sight, after the apparition of Jesus on the road to Damascus. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing he was really a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. The background to this is that there was initial distrust, because after all, Paul, or Saul as he was known, had been a persecutor of Christians. But after that was dismissed, long-term problems still remained. Paul was to some extent an interloper, getting in on their act, and he should have been a junior. But Paul was having none of that. Instead of being an apprentice to the existing disciples, he emphasized that he had been independently instructed by Jesus. Later tensions came from his rejection of the law. The author of Acts, who's also the author of the gospel known as Luke, wishes to sweep these differences under the carpet and present a picture of harmony. So the question of the Jewish law was a big problem. In Matthew, we have a verse which says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." But in Galatians, which is an undisputed writing, Paul says, "You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. But by faith we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith, expressing itself through love." So this is the background to deep differences of opinion which were existing among early Christians. The Jews that converted to Jesus believed that any Gentile that wished to do so should first become a Jew, adopting the Jewish law, including kosher food, observing the Sabbath, and if male, having part of the penis cut off. Paul realized this would lose customers and discarded it, furthering the rift with the Jewish part of the church. Matthew, of course, is the most Jewish of the Gospels. Sorry, that's women. And here we have the apostles, circumcision. And the little oddity arises in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus. In John, we read that Jesus tells Nicodemus that he must be born again. But Nicodemus does not understand and asks, "How can an old man go back into his mother's womb?" An understanding comes from the original Greek text, where the word for again is anothen. In Greek, this word means from above, as well as again. And of course, from above is what Jesus really means. But the conversation would have been in Aramaic, in which no such double meaning exists. For that reason, scholars do not believe that it took place, at least in that form. So what do we know and can say for sure about the historical Jesus? There's little doubt that he existed. I think that must be beyond all doubt from what remains in writing. He grew up in Nazareth. He was a preacher in Galilee, and he was crucified under Pilate. But many particulars in the Bible give conflicting accounts. The three synoptic Gospels portray a very different picture of Jesus from John. None of the four are eyewitness accounts. They were written in another language, that's in another country, and 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death. In many documents and inscriptions that survive from the times of the Roman Empire, outside Christian writings, there is no mention of Jesus. It's generally accepted by scholars that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. He saw the current age as being under the control of Satan, who promoted disease, evil doing, natural disasters, and death. But all of this was going to end soon, when God would exert his authority. After the apocalypse, everything would be wonderful. And life eternal would be in a kingdom of God here on earth. There would be no more death and no more evil of any kind. And this was not a place in heaven where you should go where you die, as in the Christian belief of today, but it would be a real kingdom here on the ground, ruled by his appointed Messiah. But it would be right only for those who were right with God. The sinful would go to eternal fire. People needed to repent and behave as recommended. The end of the present age would be heralded by the arrival of the Son of Man descending from the clouds. It's likely that Jesus did not claim to be this character. Indeed, he could not be if he was on earth when he arrived from heaven. But after his death, it came to be believed that they were the same. And this was all going to happen soon. In Mark, he says, I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power. But before the kingdom is established, many terrible things will happen. In Mark, he says, but in those days following that distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. I suppose it was not realized in those days, in fact, for very long afterwards, that the stars are actually distant suns. At that time, the men will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. The day of judgment is near. Those who believe in Jesus and do as he says will be the elect. Others will be punished with unimaginable severity. But you must be ready, because no one knows when the Son of Man will come. Jesus was, of course, a moral teacher, and he taught the golden rule. But unlike other moralists, he was not advocating it because it was the best thing in the long run. For Jesus, there was not going to be any long run. The picture which emerges is that Jesus picked up the apocalyptic ideas that were common in Palestine of those days and honed his skill as an apprentice with John the Baptist. He must have been a talented orator and effective at drawing large crowds. Most of his speaking career was spent in the north of Palestine, in the largely rural area of Galilee. Sorry, I advanced too far. Yep. But then at the time of the Passover festival, he embarked for the capital city. It's impossible to be sure what he believed at that time. It's probable he fully believed in the apocalyptic message, which was his stock and trade at the time. He entered the city on a donkey, as the scriptures had predicted. Maybe he thought this was when it was all going to happen. As always, he could attract a good crowd, but he also attracted the attention of the Roman authorities, and he did not make himself popular with the Sadducees. The Passover was always a time of national feeling among the Jews, and with the population of the city swollen far beyond its normal numbers due to the influx of pilgrims, the Romans regarded it as a tinderbox. So it's not surprising that they decided to get rid of Jesus. Mark records Jesus on the cross as saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? What could this mean about his belief at that time? We shall never quite know. And Jesus' message of the apocalypse is clear also in the works of Paul, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's completely absent in John. The latest of the Gospels was written 60 or 70 years after Jesus' death. Most, if not all, of those who had heard the prediction that the end times would come within their lifetimes had passed away, and still the Son of Man had not come. There was no option but to reinterpret the theology. In John, there's no more talk of an apocalypse coming soon. The kingdom of God has migrated to the kingdom of heaven. If you Google end of the world, you will find many, many predictions dating right up to quite recent times. There were some cases in America, the Millerites, where everyone gave away all their worldly goods, expecting the end to come. And when it didn't, of course, they were all rather annoyed with the prophet who'd predicted it. For without exception, when the time came, the world just kept rotating on its axis and orbiting the sun, and the ideas of the tiny human animals that inhabit its surface had no effect. All four of the Gospels are full of accounts of Jesus' miracles. It's impossible for the historian to prove or disprove whether these actually occurred. It's, of course, we have to take account of the advice of Hume, who says that before one should believe in a miracle, one must also believe the report of it being false or mistaken would be even more miraculous. But there are some suggestions that Jesus did not want to make his miracles widely known, telling people not to say anything. This occurs in Mark, but in John they were called signs, explicitly done to demonstrate proof of his identity. But the big change in John, which is now accepted in Orthodox Christianity, is that Jesus becomes deified. The gospel begins with the confusing use of the word "word," which seems to become a personage and which becomes Jesus. The gospel contains the famous "I am" statements, where Jesus claims to be God and to have existed before Abraham. He becomes the creator, he becomes God. He makes no such claim for himself in the first three scriptures. But in John, that's Hume. In John, in John, the idea of the Trinity occurs, although Trinity doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. And it was later that monotheism was reconciled with having three individuals to create the Trinity, which even today is something that, well, just don't ask. In the early days of Christianity, the new religion split into many different branches. Each leader had differing theologies, and they had different scriptures. These were mostly declared to be apocryphal, and the Orthodox version of Christianity eventually triumphed. The early division came between Paul and the Jewish Christians. Christianity was at first a sect within Judaism, and it was believed that Gentiles could be admitted only if they became Jews. And Paul, of course, worked in the other direction from that. But even after Paul's time, these differences persisted. The Ebionites were a strongly Jewish Christian sect who kept the law in its full form, whereas the Marcionites despised the Jewish traditions, rejected the old Jewish church, and they very much admired Paul. But there were also differences in theology. Some thought Jesus was simply a man given an elevated status by God. The Doceticists thought him a spirit, giving only the illusion of being a man. Not being flesh, he could not have suffered. Some thought he was a man who inhabited by a spirit, which gave him his magic powers. This spirit left him on the cross to die alone, hence his cry of despair. Some thought that Jesus was the Father himself, come in human form. This had the name Patri Passionists. The orthodox position that emerged was that Jesus was both man in the flesh and God, but not God the Father, rather part of the Trinity. The Gnostics were split into many sects of varying beliefs, but the essential was that Jesus had not come to provide salvation. He had come to provide knowledge of our essential place in heaven and how this world is an inferior place. Some believed that the creator God of the Jews was an inferior God and that the proper God was the superior one in heaven. Some believed that there were many gods. In time, the version of Christianity that we now think orthodox achieved control, and it was helped us in its adoption by becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. All other versions were suppressed as heresies. The Christian Church achieved absolute power and erased much of the classical pagan world. For 1,000 years, no one could dare to express a different view. And of course, its establishment is still very strong today, as you see here in the picture of the Vatican. And as we saw a few weeks ago in the crowds that assembled there. But the New Testament, as we know it, was formed by a process of those who were in power approving some books and rejecting others. It was finalized towards the end of the 4th century. And the sacred texts of heretics were mostly destroyed, but enough survive for scholars to build some of the history. So you might ask whether all of this study of the Bible destroys faith. I don't think so. But it certainly destroys the idea that the Bible is completely perfect and without error. But it doesn't destroy the faith of most Christians who regard the Bible as a religious guide produced by many human hands. Many academic scholars of the Bible retain their faith. On the other hand, if you have decided that religion is not true for other reasons, it doesn't destroy that position either. These decisions remain yours to make. But whatever conclusion you reach, it is valuable to study this collection of books, which has had more influence than any other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don, for a very interesting talk. You covered, 2 millennia, the birth of Jesus and Judgment Day, which we haven't experienced yet. So this could be more than 2,000 years of coverage. And you even touched on something as complex as the Trinity.
Well, I don't think I explained it, but I was only dealing with the 1st century.
It's always good to leave a cliffhanger, Don. So we now come to the questions. We start off in the room because there's lots of things packed in there in terms of scholarship of the scriptures. So who would like to ask the first question in the room, and then I'll alternate it with online? There's a gentleman in the second row.
Yeah. Are there any... What do they think the Christ's DNA would be like if some blood of Christ was found? Would it be DNA from his father, or wouldn't he have DNA? And if he doesn't have DNA, can he be human? In Egypt, the pharaohs claim to have the gods as their father, but their DNA seems to be human DNA.
Did you get that, Don?
Yes, I heard that. I think scholars are pretty silent on that because there are no samples available. But it depends entirely on one's religious beliefs. I think many would say that he would have human DNA.
The Catholic Catholic Church claims it's Christ's blood that is...
It's not going to work if you shout because he's about
he can't
30 miles away. So you need to talk into the microphone.
Okay. When the Catholics have their Mass, they claim they're drinking the blood of Christ.
Yes, that's true. It's a matter of whether one believes that. The Church of England doesn't believe that, but it says that it symbolizes the blood of Christ.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sure we're going to come into the sort of literal versus metaphorical interpretation of the scriptures at some point of the evening. But who would like to go next? Oh, gentleman in the back, and then I'll go for a couple of questions online.
Hello, Don. I'm interested really not so much in the evident contradictions of what the Bible presents about Christianity, but more in the approach to looking at the Bible as a historical text. And I think this was done by German scholars in the 19th century in what was probably considered at the time to be a revolutionary approach to religion, that the Bible was a text to be analysed and interpreted just like any other. And it began to reveal all these, as you say, contradictions, the fact that many hands, many authors had produced this. And it had all the flaws of a human document. And also at the time, the church was also under, how shall I say, under pressure from Darwin, who was, getting rid of the idea that the world was 7,000 years old and God made all the animals. And that scholarship and people like Darwin would undermine, I think, the church at the time felt very threatened by that kind of scholarship. Hence the more evangelical approach to just regarding everything in the Bible as being true. And that relies on faith, of course. You can't. I'm just interested in what your view would be on that scholarship and that attack on what was seen as the fundamentals of Christianity, the creation and Garden of Eden and so forth.
Yes, I'm not able to separate what was done by the German scholars in the early stages of this compared to what people are saying now. But obviously it's a very human document. It's, to my mind, quite impossible to believe that it's not produced by human hands. Of course, one of the misfortunes is that because we're reading copies of copies of copies, is that we cannot be absolutely sure what the original authors wrote.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions online. One is from Trevor, who says, "Thank you very much, Don. Did I understand correctly? There is no mention of Jesus in any of the Roman literature? Question mark."
There's no mention in the first century. Certainly in later centuries there is. There's one mention in Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, and that's about the year 90. But it's suspected that actually we're looking at a scribe's insertion.
Okay. We've got another one online. Any evidence as to the motivation for the Gospels? Was it a personal experience of knowing Jesus or an effort to promote his mission and movement? What was the impetus that led them to create these detailed accounts?
Well, it certainly wasn't knowing Jesus, because the people who wrote them were far removed from the place and the time. But of course, I can't speak for certain, but I imagine the desire was to write down what had been for quite some time an oral tradition.
Okay, there's another question online, and then we go back in the room. by David. He said, fascinating stuff. How much evidence is there that the gospel writers Matthew and John were the actual disciples of the same names? If John was a contemporary of Jesus, he must have been about 80 years plus when he wrote the gospel. Very old for that era.
Well, that's true, and of course probably didn't. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were appended to the Gospels several hundred years later. So almost certainly these were not the authors.
Okay, we're back in the room. Any more questions?
Thank you, Don, for a very interesting talk. Don't worry about not being able to explain the Trinity. No one ever has in 2,000 years. So that's not a problem. There is a problem, however, I think, with the Bible, with the New Testament. And the problem really lies, strangely enough, I don't know if you've looked into this at all, not so much in the Gospels, which I believe are a total fabrication, but in the much earlier documents, which are the letters. Now, there's a curious thing about the letters, I don't know if you've come across this, that nobody knew who the hell Jesus was. And that is no exaggeration. You can read those letters and you'll find very little reference to Jesus. You'll find no reference to his teaching. Paul never quotes Jesus and says you should do this because Jesus said. Nobody knows a thing about him or what he taught. That is, don't you think that's curious?
Well, it is curious. We know that Paul was somewhat estranged from the other apostles, so he may not have picked up a lot of the information that he might have done. So he was more concerned with faith than with writing a history, but the gospel writers were trying to write a history.
Okay, thank you, John. So far, we haven't really heard from the other side much. So, is there anybody there who wants to sort of talk about it from the other's perspective?
I couldn't hear that question.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a very strong point on the other side. It's just to question your, you talk of the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus and how Nicodemus wouldn't have been in a position to understand the nuances of what Jesus said in Aramaic. You've got to remember who Nicodemus was. He was a very well-educated, high-up member of the Sanhedrin who almost certainly understood the various dialects and language which were around at the time. I'm pretty sure he would have understood the nuance which Jesus was.
Of course, the conversation would have worked if they were speaking in Greek. Maybe they were.
Yeah. Yeah, so if the conversation was in Greek, it should have been fine.
Yes, we know that Jesus' language was Aramaic, but he may well have had knowledge of Greek and indeed of Hebrew.
Okay. All right, so let's have a look. I think we've got a couple more messages online. Just 1 second. Were the Gospels writers far successful in creating a narrative, a movement that survived despite persecution in volatile times, until Constantine adopted it as a religion of the world's most powerful empire, also 200 years later? Did you get that, Don?
No, I couldn't hear that one.
Okay, so I'll read it again. The microphone went off. Weren't the gospel writers rather successful in creating a narrative and movement that survived despite persecution and volatile times until Constantine adopted it as the religion of the world's most powerful empire 200 or so years later?
Yes, they did. Well, it would only have taken a fairly modest rate of growth, a few percent a year in that span of time for substantial increase to have happened. So as far as is known, the Christian faith steadily expanded during that time.
I think what that question meant is, it was actually writing down those stories that actually keep the religion alive from its sort of early birth all the way through to the establishment of it as the formal religion of the Roman Empire.
Yes, in fact, the canon wasn't even thought of in the early stages, and different writings were circulating, and one church might well have had only one book, which would be a treasured possession and would be read from during the services.
Any more questions in the room? I'm just going to try the other microphone. No? Nothing in the room? No more? There's another question online. The very end of John's Gospel. Oh, I missed it. I have to go to the back and take it online. Just one moment, Don.
Mm-hmm.
Whilst I go to the back, I've got a question. How important do you think was the Council of Nicaea to actually formalize the Gospels and the process of what was going to be in the scriptures and what wasn't?
Well, of course, it was a very important event in the history of the church. Constantine's aim, of course, was to unify his empire. And he definitely wanted to unify Christianity. And he probably wasn't too concerned about what exactly the details. But certainly he rather pushed the heads together to try and get them to agree.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions online. Trevor has another question. People did write at the time of Jesus. Isn't it surprising that nothing has been found when so much has been found from that time?
It is extraordinary that we have nothing written from the lifetime of Jesus. And in fact, Jesus never wrote anything himself, or if he did, it didn't survive. But that's certainly the fact.
Okay, and there's also another one from Chris. Jesus is depicted often as a powerful exorcist. What can be made of this? Was it insanity or psychosomatic illness so widespread in his world, or is this a proxy for other issues?
Well, of course, I touched lightly on the miracles and said that the historian can really say nothing about these. You've got to realize this was a narrative being made up from an oral tradition, which may have been embellished.
Okay. Another one online, unless people want to come in the room. The very end of John's Gospel, which looks like an addition, appears to be there to justify the idea that John would live to see Jesus' return. Does that support the idea that John was the author?
Well, it's a difficult situation because it appears reasonably certain that Jesus did predict an apocalypse within the lifetime of those alive at the time, and it didn't happen. So that appears in the Synoptic Gospels. So that's something that we are stuck with.
Okay, and then Robert has got another question online. What do the apocrypha reveal about Jesus, original's teachings, versus the worldly concerns of those that identify with which writings should and which should not be allowed in the Bible?
Well, the apocrypha do have a range of different ideas. Some of them I touched on, the idea of the Doceticists who felt that he was only a spirit, he wasn't a flesh and blood person at all. And then the other people who thought he was inhabited by a spirit. So all these different ideas were produced by different groups, but were in the end declared heretical.
Okay, well, I think we've got another question in the room. We're out online, so if you've got another question in the room, please let yourself be known after this question.
Hello, Don. Can I come back to the question before last about no evidence for Jesus? In your studies, have you found any evidence at all? There was no evidence, contemporary evidence. Nobody in the New Testament, apart from the Gospels, knew anything about him. Actually, didn't know a thing about him. Never knew what he taught. The Josephus, which we're told about, is definitely a forgery for a whole lot of reasons. There's a second mention which someone says is Josephus talking about Jesus, but it's not. It's talking about Jesus the high priest. That's quite clear if you read on. And there was also, interestingly, a dog that didn't bark. There was a man called Philo of Alexandria who was a Jew and very educated in Greek culture. And he was very interested in the state of religion in Judea at the time. And he went there and he reported on the Essenes. Very interesting, he thought the Essenes were. He reported on the followers of John the Baptist. He reported on the Sadducees and the Pharisees that we hear about in the Bible. But nowhere did Philo mention a Jesus or any of his followers. And the final bit of evidence is that if you look at the Gospels, there's no interesting original teaching in it. Every bit of it is cobbled together from the Old Testament and the Jewish apocrypha. So I don't know what you think about, having studied it, do you think there really was any evidence for a Jesus?
I think it's probably beyond doubt that there was a man called Jesus. Whether he had any supernatural power, of course, is something that one could question. But for there not to have been any Jesus, I think is difficult to believe, bearing in mind the number of ancient documents that mention him. Although the trouble is, most of them were written after his crucifixion. In fact, I think probably all of them that are known.
All we know is that whether he existed or not, he gave rise to the most populous religion in the world.
He didn't exist.
Well, the religion is there. It's a bit like Socrates and Plato, to be discussed separately.
There's a lot of other writing about Socrates.
Yes, by Plato. So, are we out now? Are we any more questions in the room? Because I think there were no more online. Was there another one online? I go back to the back of the room one more time to see where we get to with the online questions. Right, is there one out there? Sorry, let me just scroll down. No. Another one from Trevor. The Christian church seems to ignore all the discrepancies in the Bible you've mentioned.
Well, it is true that they're not emphasized because they probably don't serve a religious function. But certainly ministers and priests in the college, they study this material, but they don't often use it in the sermons.
Okay, we've got another two questions. Ladies first. Over to you, Marie-Louise.
Thank you, Don. I just wonder, a lot of Dead Sea Scrolls have been discovered. Have they revealed any information that would enhance the Bible or tell us different stories? Have you heard about that?
Yes, I have heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls and I've read some books about them, but I'm not an expert in them. I think the message is one which many people nowadays have found disappointing, in that it doesn't really directly mention Jesus or things that we find in the Bible, but it was another sect in an environment in which there were many different sects.
Yes, it's just an observation, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I guess it's very easy to pick holes in the story. Lack of evidence 2,000 years ago. I just make the observation that given the problems we have in the modern world, perhaps time would be better spent in actually analysing the text and what those say about the way we should live our lives, some of the bigger questions of life, than nitpicking about who said what at what particular time.
I think that's a valid choice, and many people do use the Bible for exactly that purpose. But tonight I've been talking about studying it from a historical point of view, and that does pull out the contradictions. So it's there's no reason for us to hide these contradictions from ourselves.
Yeah, and despite the German scholarship in the 19th century, the numbers of Christianity are going up. So I think, it's one thing analyzing the text for consistency. The underlying deep beliefs and ethics behind it obviously still speak to people today. Okay, if there's no more questions now, then, Don has spent a lot of time pulling all of this together from various sources. So can you please put your hands together to show your appreciation?